Hello, welcome back to Behind the Faders, the live sound channel. Today I want to talk about drums. I will not talk about drum miking because I already made an entire video about miking drums and I will link it in the description box, of course. However, when it comes to miking drums, I want to double down on one point. If I were to ask you what is the most made mistake in miking drums, what would you say? It's not mic choice, because after all, there's no right or wrong. If you have an unusual mic at an unusual position and you like how it sounds, do it. It's also not mic placement. It is actually loose mic stands. I see it all the time. People don't pay too much attention. So I see overheads bending down or twisting, snare mics resting on the rim of the drum after a while, all that kind of stuff. And I learned this the hard way, if you will, because on my very first big tour back in 1994, it was a kind of rock musical tour. And it was huge. It was the biggest indoor production ever to tour in Germany at that point. I had 15 trucks and 5 crew buses. Little side story here. I will never forget that moment when I walked into this arena where we were going to set up for the rehearsal. There were 125 rigging motors hanging off the roof. That was pretty impressive. Anyway, one of my duties on this tour was miking the drums. And when we went on tour, we would stay in one venue for 3 days, doing 2 shows a day. So after I mic'd the drums, these stands had to hold up a long time. And one day, the drum tech came over to me, and he was really mad at me and shouted at me that he was so tired of fixing my mistakes because my mic stands were never tight enough, so they would move after a while. And ever since then, this never happened to me again. That guy was so mad at me. There's also, I always tell you that I like to mic my drums myself. It doesn't matter how big the production is. I wouldn't have to do it myself, but first of all, I kind of like doing it. I like the process of it. But then again, something inside me, I know, I mean, everybody else on this tour will be a highly trained professional, and I'm doing them wrong here. But something inside me doesn't trust anybody else to tighten up the mic stands well enough. So that's maybe one reason I do it myself. Okay, enough about that. The mixing. Of course, when it comes to mixing drums, it's really genre dependent. And there's a huge range of ways a drum kit needs to sound depending on the genre. So let's start small and quiet with like a jazz or a folk band in a little club. In that case, miking will just be maybe the kick drum and 2 overheads. And EQing-wise, in this context, usually the kick drum doesn't play a big role, and it's not meant to be that massive or impressive as in rock or pop. So most of the time, the guys just want it to sound like it naturally sounds. So it won't even have a hole in the skin, so you just put the microphone in front of it, and it will make bops. And you can, most of the time, leave the EQ flat even, because that bops, which is usually the part of the signal that we carve out, it's exactly what they want. They don't want any bottom end. And at least wait until the entire band plays and see if that bops is exactly what it's supposed to sound like. And the overheads, well, they will need a low cut probably, and that might be it. Especially in a small environment where so much comes from the stage directly. If they even play a role, it will not be a large role. So you can leave everything flat, job done. Now, of course, between this and a rock pop band, there's a lot of genres in between. Like more modern jazz where the drums are supposed to come in a little bit harder and louder. But in this whole genre, they still want the drums to sound very natural, so not to have too much processing on it. So I now may close mic the entire drum kit, so also the snare, the hi-hat, and the toms. Just try to keep the EQ pretty flat. Don't do too much to it. So let's come to the fun part. I mean, what's more fun than mixing a punchy and impressive drum kit, right? So first things first, when you sound check the drums, don't let the drummer go drum by drum by drum. Just let him play the entire instrument and take it from there. Because now the drummer plays like he usually plays, because if the drummer is just kicking the kick drum or just hitting the snare, he will very often hit it a lot harder than he really plays. So first of all, he plays that he really plays. Then it's a lot more fun for him. And you've got all the crosstalk and spill that you will have during the show from the beginning. So you're working with the spill. And another advantage would be if you're working with a monitor engineer, you can work on different things at the same time. So while you're figuring out the snare reverb, he can distribute the kick drum throughout his monitor mixes, stuff like that. So it's a win-win-win-win situation. So just let the drummer play the whole kit. Now, I always start like everybody else. I start with a kick drum, which of course will need some bottom end, which lives between 60 and 80 hertz usually. Actually, play a little where the frequency button and find the spot where the bass drum wants to have its bottom end, and give it a low cut. We don't want to blow a lot of hot air into a system that you can't hear and you can't feel, and you're just maybe your overdrive components. So a low cut at like 30 hertz. Then of course you have to carve out some of the bops that we needed for the jazz. So some low mids, that can be anywhere around 150 even, up to 500. And don't be shy. Sometimes that needs to be really, really drastic. Especially because if the drummer is using like a traditional drum fill, you will have a lot of these frequencies coming from the stage out of that drum fill. When it comes to the attack, there are different approaches. You can just give it a high shelf, or you can give it a little boost at the beta frequency, like 2.5K, and then another click somewhere up the frequency range at like 8 or so. However, to decide about the amount of attack you want to give to the bass drum, you will have to wait until the entire band plays. Before that, you can't really judge it, so don't spend too much time with it when you listen to it in solo. When it comes to dynamics for the kick drum, I don't use gates. So if you want to know about how to use a noise gate, you will have to ask somebody else. What I like to use is a transient designer to shape the transients, the attack and the release. If I don't have a transient designer, I kind of mimic at least the attack side of it with a bit of a compression with a long attack time. So the compressor will let the initial transient through, so the kick, if you will, and then starts to compress. Don't overdo it, but try it. Sometimes it gives you a little bit more punch. Next up, if the venue is big enough, so using overheads doesn't even make sense, then I would listen to my overheads next and then leave them on. What they will need, well, they will need a low cut. And sometimes, depending on the way the drummer plays, you will have to take the harshness out of the cymbals, which is then around 3K. If you're lucky, you have a good drummer who doesn't hit the cymbals so hard, so you can even leave that flat. Then, where the overheads open, we listen to our snare. If you have snare top and bottom, don't forget to flip the polarity of the bottom mic. On the snare, which I usually do, I find a bottom, which is, of course, a low cut. Again, 100, 150 even. I will find the bottom of the snare, usually living around 200 hertz, and give that a nice boost. And then what I do, which is, I think, pretty unusual, a narrow boost around 1.6K. It's this muck, which I find very helpful to make the snare cut through the mix, and I just like the way that sounds. And then you can give it a high shelf or a boost something up in the 6 to 8K range, but be careful not to get too much spill from the hi-hat when you do that. Sometimes I even high cut the snare mic at 8K and boost a little bit below that, just in order try to avoid too much spill from the hi-hat. When it comes to dynamics, pretty much the same as for the kick drum. So I don't use noise gates. Again, a little compression with a long attack time will sometimes help. But again, be careful with it. And then, of course, a little plate reverb. Try 1.5 seconds. I usually don't use a pre-delay. And snare bottom, I usually give it a low cut around 150 hertz and leave it. I might put a compressor on it, and I usually don't send snare bottom to the reverb. For me, it's just to get a little bit of the actual snare. When we talk about hi-hat, this is still about miking. I've found that the best way for me is to mic the hi-hat from underneath. But anyway, if you even use the hi-hat mic, because like I said, the snare mic will catch a lot of hi-hat anyway. A low cut as high as it gets, and I usually leave it alone. Toms. Well, toms are very often a problem because far too many drummers don't tune them right, and they have old skins on them. So toms very often sound far from ideal, and it gets worse with size. And one thing you should learn quickly when you're starting out is when not to care too much about toms, because they will sound like shit anyway, no matter what you do to them. But if they sound decent, you pretty much handle them like a snare, because they are similar to a snare. So you find the bottom end of a drum, which of course is different for each size. On the small toms, I usually search around 200, while an 18-inch floor tom might go down to 60. Then you might, on the bigger toms, might have to carve out some low mids. Then you have this stick attack frequency around 2.5K, and then you have the kind of top end, which is around 6K. So that goes pretty much for all the toms. Then, of course, you pan them. It's your decision if you want to pan them like all the way or just in like reasonable boundaries, but you pan them. As for dynamics, if you don't use noise gates, well, if I have enough transit designer channels, I will use transit designer on them. And pretty much the same reverb that I use for the snare. That's your drum kit. Of course, there are many other possible options of things that could be on a drum kit. You can have a large gong in the back, you can have rototoms and octobans and a cowbell, or chimes, or a triangle, all kinds of toys. It's just too much to cover. And most of these things don't need an extra microphone. They come across well enough through all the other mics on the drum kit, especially the overheads, of course, or anything that's near them. And that's pretty much it for today. If you have questions or comments, leave them in the comment section. If you have a lot of questions, maybe consider booking yourself a coaching call. They start at 15 minutes. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do it. There's still a lot of people haven't subscribed to my channel, even though they watch the videos regularly. It's just a click. Free for you. Helps me so much. I'll see you around. Bye-bye.